Hello everyone. So today we will be discussing the round 2 motion for Division 2 for SSSDC 2023. The motion is this house believes that being the host nation for a major international sports event is a good investment for developing countries. So before we move on into discussing the case for the proposition team and the opposition team, let's first look at some of the terms in the motion. So the first term I think we should pay attention to is this term host nation. So I think some questions you want to ask yourself is, what does it mean to be a host nation? What are the responsibilities involved? What is the process by which the host nation is decided? And maybe this will give us a better understanding of whether this is a good investment or not, which brings me very nicely to the second term, which needs a bit of definition, the term good investment. So the word good investment actually is a bit ambiguous. It's not very clear what it means for something to be a good investment. Do you mean good investment in the monetary sense, in the sense that it brings a lot of economic benefits? Or do you think maybe it's a good investment in the sense that it's good for developing national pride? So it's also important for us to be very clear and specific on what do we mean when we say that this is a good investment. The last term that we probably need to define is developing nations. So this motion is not generally about whether hosting such events is good or bad, but it's very specific to the context of developing countries. So we need to make sure that all of our outcomes are not just generically good, but very nuanced and specific to the context of developing nations. What are the problems they face? What is the situation they're in? What are the interests that they have? So with these words and these terms out of the way, now let's discuss the proposition case. So before we go into the proposition case proper, I think it would be good to do at least a bit of framing. So there are two things here that I think would be useful for the proposition case in framing. So the first is that the motion presumes that the country has been selected for the bid. So it's not about whether the country should desire to bid for the event in the first place, but it's actually about the process of hosting such an event, which means that the country will have been selected. So I won't go into too much detail here, but countries are not randomly selected for the Olympics bid. They actually have to put up a proposal, they have to put up a bid, and then there's like a very rigorous and complex selection process where there is some evaluation about whether they will be suitable to host such events in the first place. There'll be some evaluations on the sites and the proposed areas in which the Olympics will be held. So that's the first. The second piece of framing is that there has been a lot of backlash against the international sporting committees, for example, FIFA due to the Qatar World Cup, or the Olympics Committee due to the Rio Olympics. And so because these committees have faced such backlash, there's actually been a lot of internal changes within the committee to kind of prevent such harms from happening again in the future. So an example of this would be environmental or social impact committees that kind of assess the potential impact of hosting such a major event, and then they work to minimize the impact so that the host nation wouldn't be so severely affected, and then we wouldn't see a repeat of very terrible things that happened in the past. So one of the very landmark cases that people like to frequently reference is the Rio 2016 Olympics, when they're talking about environmental damage, when they're talking about social cultural impacts, and when they're talking about economic impacts. And so these committees are aware of the things that happened in the past, and therefore, in order to minimize the backlash from the public and in order to remain socially relevant, they have done certain steps in place to prevent such things from happening to such a severe extent. So the reason why this framing is useful is because the most intuitive opposition case is to say that these major sporting events bring a lot of social harm, they bring a lot of economic harm, and you want to frame your case in a way that kind of minimizes those accusations by saying that, firstly, we're not talking about any random country that doesn't have the infrastructure or doesn't have the budget to host such an event. They have to be first selected by the committee, which means that they are competent or they're suitable to some extent. And then the second piece of framing is that obviously these international sporting committees are not as evil or apathetic as people like to think. They do have some concerns about the host nation also not being severely impacted negatively. And therefore, there's these creations of committees, advisors, in order to prevent such terrible things from happening. So this framing could be useful in mitigating preemptively a lot of the worst harms coming from the opposition team. Now that we've discussed the framing, we can go into argumentation proper. So the first is that before we talk about the practical benefits, right, which probably are plenty and you can probably think of many practical benefits already, let's first discuss something that is a bit less intuitive, maybe it's a bit less standard, but talking about the potential principal benefits of hosting such an event, maybe it brings about a sense of national pride because you have people from all over the world coming to your country, watching the games in your country. Even if they don't travel to your country, they're watching the games on their television, right? So millions, if not billions of people from all around the world are looking at your country. And maybe this is a sense of national pride for people where they feel very proud that their country is on the international stage, where they can showcase their culture and the beautiful sights in their country, and they can show this off to the rest of the international community. Perhaps this is particularly beneficial for developing countries. When we think of tourist sites or when we think of places that are very beautiful, unfortunately, many of the things that come to our mind tend to be very developed countries, right? So we think of Paris, we think of London, we think of Italy, we think of all of these European or Western nations. And perhaps this is also a form of neo-colonization, where a lot of people from developing countries are unable to feel that sense of pride, where they do not feel like they belong on the international stage. Or maybe they feel a bit ashamed of their country because they've never been put on such an international stage before. So one way in which they can get a sense of national pride is being included in this legacy of such prestigious events, to say that my country also is worthy of hosting such an event that is so beloved by the entirety of the human race, for this country to stand up there in the lineage with other countries like London or other countries like the US. And so that is perhaps a potential principal benefit that people feel very happy, that it is a sense of pride for them. But maybe on a deeper level, it could also be a way for them to kind of be more involved in sports as well. Because even if you're not someone who watches sports for leisure, if your country is the one hosting the event, you're very likely to tune in and you're very likely to support the event, and you're very likely to want to support your country's athletes. And perhaps maybe you could run like a smaller benefit here about how this is actually very good for the sports culture in the country, how it makes people more engaged and involved in sports, which might also improve funding for sports. I'm not sure this is a very major point in the debate, but perhaps it's just like one interesting idea for you to think about that is not very standard or not very conventional. I think many of you who have seen this debate done many times, maybe the wording of the motion would have been slightly different, but it's very frequent for motions about the Olympics or motion about major sporting events to come out. And so perhaps this idea of the sports culture in the country is a slightly more unconventional, less standard argument that you could think about, as opposed to the very stock arguments that we frequently see people run about the practical benefits. Which brings me very nicely to the second thing I want to talk about in the proposition case, which is the practical benefits. So there are numerous benefits from hosting a major international sporting event. So the first is of the revenue from the event itself. So when people are tuning in to watch the event, when people show up to the event, when people buy merchandise, when people buy tickets, these are all huge sums of money that can be generated just from the event itself. The second, which is obviously a very frequent argument that people bring up in such debates, is the huge boost in tourism, because you have people from all around the world traveling to your country to watch the event. They might stay longer afterwards, which means that you boost tourism, because after the event, they would want to go and see the cultural sites, or they want to see the natural beauty. They would therefore contribute a lot to the tourist industry because they will need things like hotels, they will buy things like souvenirs, they will eat at your restaurants. All of these are financial injections into the economy where your tourists spend a lot of money. And also because a lot of these tourists tend to come from the developed nation where the currency is much stronger, this could also mean that they spend huge amounts of money when they are in these developing nations, which also could be a huge source of income for many people that work in the service industry or work in the tourism industry. But it's not only just this short-term boost in tourism as well. The huge spotlight that is on the country from hosting such an event also gives the country a huge ability to market itself, to focus on its culture, to talk about all of its beautiful sites, to talk about all of the reasons why you should visit the country. And this means that even in the long term, you might see a net increase in tourism because now more people are aware and more people are enticed to go and visit the country because they have hosted such a major sporting event, and because of the marketing and because of the attention that they received from hosting such a major sporting event. So that is the argument about tourism and why there is a benefit to it. But the other argument that you could run about why there is a benefit to hosting such a major international sporting event is because of the creation of infrastructure. So in order to accommodate all of the athletes that are coming, in order to accommodate all of the visitors that are coming, countries tend to have huge investments into infrastructure. Things like improving their public transport infrastructure so that it's easier for tourists to get around. Things like improving the electricity, the utilities, the water, all of these things, right? Because one of the concerns that countries have when they're hosting such a major international sporting event is they want to present a good image to the rest of the world. They want to make sure that the visitors and tourists that come have a good impression of the country and can conveniently get around. So one of the things they do is that they make huge investments and huge improvements to the infrastructure, and this is something that the locals themselves can benefit from after the tourists leave. So after the event is over, after the hype of the event dies down, all of this infrastructure will still remain, and this is good for the locals. And then perhaps the last point here is that there's a huge attraction of investment. So there's a huge increase in foreign direct investment because a lot of these investors now see this as a very lucrative opportunity because they know that many people from the developed world are coming to this country to spend a lot of money, which means that perhaps businesses now want to move into the country in order to leverage off the fact that there's going to be a huge market now. Perhaps this also attracts banks because they want to help the business with their business activity, provide them loans, provide them a way for them to store their money, which means that you have the ability for you now to access the international financial world, for you to access international financial markets. All of these things are also beneficial to locals and local businesses as well. And perhaps maybe just the attraction of foreign direct investment. So foreign investment into local firms because they see a potential for local firms to grow exponentially because of this influx of people coming in, and because of this influx of economic activity because of such a large-scale event. So these are all of the economic benefits to hosting such a major sporting event. But for this motion, it's not enough for you to very generically argue that this is something that is going to be very economically beneficial. You actually need to explain why, in the specific context of the developing nation, why is it the case that they need these benefits. So the first argument that you could run is that this is really good for the diversification of the economy. So perhaps a lot of these developing nations tend to be overly reliant on one part of their economy. So a very common example is the over-reliance on the export of natural resources. So these are your primary industries, or perhaps an over-reliance on things like your manufacturing or your export industries. And the reason why this is bad or this is dangerous is because it's very easy for your economy to be affected by external shocks if it's overly reliant on one aspect of the economy. So for example, if you're overly reliant on exporting oil, if there is suddenly a shift away from oil and perhaps a shift to more renewable sources, your economy will take a hit, your overall government revenue would severely decline. Therefore, it's much better to have a diverse economy because therefore, even if one aspect of your economy tanks, even if one aspect of your economy is less profitable, you still have other aspects of the economy to rely on. So perhaps that's why we need to diversify away from primary industries or secondary industries and improve things like the tourism sector and the service sector. So that's the first reason as to why diversification might be good, because it helps you prevent external shocks from affecting your economy too much. But the second reason as to why the diversification of economy could be good could be like a contextual reason. So for example, just natural resources, people are shifting away from it and shifting towards green technology and green energy and renewable sources. And the third, last, final reason why diversification of the economy might be good is that a lot of these primary and secondary industries are actually not very differentiated. So if you sell oil, it's very different. It's very difficult for you to say that my oil is different from another country's oil. And because the products are not differentiated, a lot of these countries have to compete based on price. And therefore, there's a race to the bottom to have like the cheapest exports, the cheapest oil, the cheapest exported goods. Which also means that the economy is not very profitable by relying on these industries that tend to compete based on price. Because the things that they are exporting are not differentiated. And therefore, it might be good to differentiate into the service industry, to differentiate in the tourism industry, where you are not competing just solely based on price, but you're also competing based on providing unique and new and interesting experiences. And therefore, the axis in which they are competing on in the service industry or the tourism industry is more differentiated. So that's like the first specific reason why it's really good for developing countries to have these economic benefits. But the second is that it provides an incentive to improve infrastructure. So a lot of these developing nations struggle with having the incentive to invest in things like public transport, either because there's an issue with the way that money is allocated, or because the governments themselves don't see it as a very pressing issue or are concerned with other issues on the country's agenda instead. And so hosting a major international sporting event kind of forces the government, therefore, to reflect on the infrastructure and whether it's something that's efficient, whether there's something that's working properly. And absent from hosting such an event, the infrastructure in the country might never receive that degree of attention. And like the very good intuition pump for this is that if the government would have paid attention to the infrastructure, they would have done it already. But the fact that we see a lot of very inefficient infrastructure in the developing nations is precisely because governments right now lack an incentive or lack the capacity for you to improve such infrastructure. Which brings me very nicely to the last point about why it's uniquely important in the context of developing countries, which is just for the simple point that there's more government revenue for things like improving infrastructure, for things like social welfare, for things like healthcare, education, etc. So perhaps the reason why they're not currently investing in infrastructure is simply because of monetary constraints, where they do not have enough money to invest in things like improving the railway system or improving the public transportation system or improving the electricity or the energy grids in the country. And so by having an event that significantly boosts economic activity, that directly generates revenue for the country, and also one that attracts a lot of foreign direct investment, it actually empowers the government to have a very strong source of revenue that they can now use on things like improving infrastructure. So this is the benefits of the proposition case. But the important thing here is not just to list out benefits, but it's also important to, one, explain why these benefits are uniquely important in the context of the developing country, and two, explain why these benefits are mutually exclusive, meaning to say why you would not be able to get these benefits absent from hosting a major international sporting event. So it's very difficult for you to get huge degrees of foreign direct investment unless you can prove to them that there's going to be exponential growth or like a lot of lucrative economic activity happening in the country. And one of the best ways to do that is to actually host an international sporting event that kind of brings in people from all around the world, and all of the people that are coming from all parts of the world are prepared to spend a lot of money and tend to be very high income individuals as well. But the mutual exclusivity doesn't just exist in terms of the economic benefits, it also exists in terms of the incentive, where it's mutually exclusive that you provide the incentive of the government to spend money in this specific way, because it plays on the government's incentive to want to present a very good image to the international community. It plays on the government incentive to want to accommodate to the tourists and accommodate to the visitors and to accommodate to the international community, when otherwise they might not really have given much care or much thought to the country's infrastructure. So that wraps up very quickly the proposition case. Now let's switch gears a bit and we can talk about the opposition case. So the first thing about the opposition case would be a bit of context. And the first piece of context would be the dynamics between the sports committee and the host country. And one interesting fact that you'll find upon researching this motion is that actually the host nation receives a huge minority of the profits of such events. So most of the broadcasting rights don't go to the host country or the host broadcasters. It actually goes to the international sports committee. So it's, I can't remember the exact number, but it's like somewhere around like 70% of the overall broadcasting revenue goes to the international sports committee, and that's one of the ways in which they earn the money. Another thing is that all the merchandise and all the ticket sales, they go to the committee, they don't go to the host country. So that's one aspect of the dynamic that you might want to contextualize. The second context of the dynamic is which entity bears which cost. So in terms of like flying the athletes down, paying for their flights and stuff, those costs are borne, those costs are borne by the committee, so the IOC or FIFA. But in terms of the construction of the stadiums, the construction of the various infrastructure required for the event, so like the Olympic Village, any of the roads necessary for you to connect different parts of the Olympic Village together, all of those costs are solely borne by the host country. And so those are the two aspects of the dynamic you might want to contextualize and clarify. The first is that the majority of the revenue generated goes directly to the sports committee. And the second is that most of the costs of like setting up such an event is borne by the host country. And so this first piece of contextualization actually does good work in mitigating the benefits of the proposition case that we just heard, right? We are first mitigating that you don't actually get a lot of profits from hosting this event. And the simple reason is because the way that the income structure is designed is so that the majority of the profits actually go towards the IOC, or it goes towards FIFA. And the second piece of context that we're using to mitigate the proposition case that we just heard is that there are huge costs involved, and most of the costs are not subsidized or borne by the IOC, but they are solely taken by the host country. So that's the first piece of context. Second piece of context is that there's a lot of pressure or coercion to host such events. There's a huge amount of prestige involved, which means that a lot of countries end up blindly chasing this honor and this glory of hosting the Olympics or hosting the World Cup, for the simple reason that it's something that's celebrated by the entirety of humanity. And so because of this pressure, because of this coercion, they're unable to really weigh the costs and the benefits. They're unable to properly assess the economic damage that it might do to their country, because they are just so blinded by the fact that this is such a prestigious opportunity for them. So these are the first two pieces of context that we can use to kind of mitigate some aspects of the proposition case. The second piece of context suggests that countries might not be entirely rational when choosing to bid for such events. Now let's talk about the arguments. So the first argument is actually quite the opposite of the proposition argument that we heard, right? So the proposition argument that we heard and we discussed previously was that this is something that gets a lot of money. The first argument that we'll discuss on opposition is the opposite, is that this loses a lot of money. And so the first thing to discuss is that this is a huge infrastructural requirement. So the amount of infrastructure that you need to build in order to host such massive events where thousands and thousands of people are coming to your country cannot be understated. The various stadiums that you have to build, right? Like if you're talking about Olympics, you need a swimming, you need like a swimming stadium, you need to build like an ice rink, you need to build like a soccer stadium, you need to build like a stadium for your track and field events. And not only do you need to build such stadiums, all of these stadiums need to be Olympic signs. And then you also need to build all of the Olympic villages to host all of the athletes. You need to build like a media village. You need to build like a ceremonial space. And all of these things also need to accommodate thousands and thousands of people. And so there is a huge amount of infrastructure that's required in order for you to build, in order for you to be able to host such an event. Obviously, the proposition here can push back by saying that, well, this is actually really good for generating jobs. This is actually really good as an indirect way for the government to kind of spend money and kind of inject money into the economy, because when they're building all of this infrastructure, obviously they are contracting this to construction firms, and therefore the construction firms are able to hire more people, they're able to pay the wages of these people, therefore due to like the circular flow of money in the economy, actually people are benefited, right? So maybe that's the proposition pushback. But the opposition argument here is that it is very costly. And perhaps this is a cost that the governments of developing nations are not prepared to take because they are already struggling financially, and therefore taking like such a multi-million-dollar or billion-dollar project where they have to build like stadiums that cost billions of dollars is something that's unfeasible. The second thing is that these infrastructures tend to benefit tourists and not necessarily locals. So if you notice, one of the arguments that we talked about in proposition is about how this creates very good infrastructure. The pushback on opposition is that this infrastructure benefits tourists, not locals. So if you're building things like hotels, if you're building things like very fancy tourist attraction or very like big expensive malls, a lot of these things are going to be in areas that do not benefit the average person living in the country, or are inaccessible to the average person living in the country because of the reason that it's just so prohibitively expensive. And therefore, infrastructure, one, will primarily benefit tourists because they're creating tourist infrastructure. And two, the infrastructure improvement tend to be very localized to the area where the event is held, which means that the more residential areas that are outside the city do not have benefits in terms of infrastructure. So that's a way in which you can push back against the proposition argument about improvements to infrastructure, and you can mitigate the extent of their benefits there. But the second thing to note here is that a lot of this infrastructure is needlessly expensive because they're trying to appear very grand, or they're trying to appear very aesthetic. So an example I can think of off the top of my head is that the 2008 Beijing Olympics, the stadiums that they built was specifically made to look very aesthetic. So for example, the swimming stadium was made to look like an ice cube or something, and then they had a stadium that was made to look like a bird's nest. They are spending like an extra million or if not billions of dollars just to make it look very fancy or make it look very attractive so that they can wow the international committee. But if you think about it, it's not actually a very useful way for you to spend money, because you're just using the money not to tangibly improve the lives of people, but just to impress the international committee. And a principal argument could be run here about the ways in which governments should spend money. That because they're using taxpayers' money and because the voters have entrusted them with the budget, therefore, they should spend the money in the way that directly benefits people instead of spending money in a way to build needlessly grand and aesthetic stadiums just to impress visitors that will be in the country for maybe 1 or 2 weeks, and then they'll forget about the country and never visit again. So maybe that's a principal angle that we can add to this argument. But the fourth and final point here is that a lot of this infrastructure goes obsolete afterwards. And there are various reasons for this. So the first reason is that the maintenance costs are just simply too high, and therefore the government cannot finance the maintenance of the stadium, and so the stadium eventually just crumbles apart. So you can go and look at the aftermath of the Rio Olympics and how a lot of the stadiums actually just go into complete ruin and are completely unused. But the second reason is that there's just not a lot of reasons as to why people will want to use it. Like, besides hosting such major events, there are very few other events or purposes in which the stadiums could be used for, and therefore they're just they're used incredibly infrequently, and they become obsolete, which means that it's a huge waste of money. After proving why these events tend to be very expensive, this proves the second premise, which is that these events tend to go over budget. So an example and some statistics that you can look at is the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics went over budget by $41 billion, which is actually a crazy amount of money. And the 2016 Rio Olympics went over budget by $17.2 billion. Again, an exorbitant amount. And because there are so much cost associated with hosting such a major sporting event, it's very easy for the event to go over budget. And the problem is that once you've committed to hosting the event, you can no longer backtrack. You have to see it through. You have to host the event, which means that governments often accept and allow for the budget to go over. And because it's so difficult to finance, and because the costs tend to stack up and the costs are incredibly exorbitant, the government often finds problematic ways to finance such large-scale events. So this could look like increasing taxes from citizens in order to gain more government revenue to build the stadiums, or in extremely regrettable cases, it could look like reducing government spending on things like social welfare or redirecting the budget from other parts, for example, healthcare or education, in order to put more money into the budget for the Olympics or for the World Cup. And so these are problematic ways of financing such large events. Again, we can use the same principle angle here of how it's bad to worsen the lives and worsen the lived experiences of your citizens in order to host an event to wow and to amaze and to impress these tourists and the international committee. But there is another way in which these countries might finance such expensive events, and this is from taking loans. And the problem with taking loans is that they'll often be very difficult to pay back. And there are various reasons for this. The first is like currency depreciation. So if you take a foreign loan that's denominated in a foreign currency, for example, USD, you are using your domestic currency, which is much weaker, in order to pay off that foreign loan, which means that in the event where your currency depreciates, which is very plausible given that it's a developing nation, suddenly you find your debt doubling or tripling overnight in the case where your currency depreciates, which means that your debt becomes almost impossible to pay back in such scenarios. But the second simple reason as to why the loans are difficult to pay back is because the infrastructure doesn't generate profit. So you're taking a loan to pay this incredibly expensive stadium. You're loaning like millions of dollars from various different financial institutions and perhaps various different countries. And the thing that you're spending money on doesn't generate profit for you. And so there comes the question of how will you pay back this loan if what you spent it on doesn't generate money? And obviously, there are a lot of negative outcomes that happen when you are unable to pay back your loan, right? It hurts your credit rating, which means that it affects your ability to get future developmental aid. It affects how attractive you are to foreign investors. And in the very worst case, certain terms or conditions might be imposed on countries that are unable to pay back their loan. And all of these are just unnecessary problems that are caused because they've taken on a loan to pay back, to pay for these very expensive stadiums. And the last thing to talk about here in terms of these things being very expensive is that governments are pressured to finance it because it's a huge embarrassment if they host a bad event. It's a huge embarrassment if they are unable to be prepared on the deadline of the event. And also because the deadlines for these events are very tight. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, the number of years that the Rio Olympics had to prepare was around like 7 or 8, which in the grand scheme of things is actually an incredibly tight deadline. You are having to build multiple stadiums and prepare huge amounts of infrastructure, and you're given like less than a decade to prepare for this huge amount of infrastructure being built. And so, because they're so pressured to finance it in such a short period of time, notice how this increases the propensity for them to do very problematic things in order to raise finances, right? So like things like increasing taxes, reducing government spending, and taking on loans. And here's the impact of the expenditure, right? Here's the impact of it being very expensive. The first very simple impact is that the money could have been better spent elsewhere. You could have spent it on education, healthcare, any other thing that would have been much better than building these obsolete stadiums meant to host an event for just 1 or 2 weeks. But the second impact that you can kind of draw is like a political impact, which is like civil instability. So if you live in a developing nation where your day-to-day is already, you're struggling financially, and then you see your government spending very lavishly on these tourists and like spending exorbitantly on these very fancy and grand stadiums, there's going to be a part of you that feels very aggrieved and feels very wronged. When your community and yourself are struggling financially and you are constantly asking the government for things like more welfare and more financial support, and the government constantly ignores you, and then subsequently the government spends billions and billions of dollars building all of these stadiums, is likely going to make you incredibly upset. It's likely going to cause civil instability and political instability. And so, again, this could be a possible clash with the proposition point that we mentioned earlier. Because one of the proposition points that was mentioned earlier is this idea of national pride, why people are happy when they are able to host such events. But ironically, it could be a source of anger, it could be a source of resentment, because they see the government spending on these tourists and these foreigners and visitors instead of spending it on the people that need it the most vulnerable individuals, perhaps those living in poverty that desperately need social welfare and the government support. But this debate is not just about the economic impacts. As I alluded to at the start, there is a social cultural dimension to this debate as well. And so the first thing that we could discuss here is about population displacement. So this happened in the Rio Olympics, and it was a very infamous case where a lot of communities were affected. But this also happened in the Tokyo Olympics, where a lot of communities were kind of displaced and thrown around because they needed to build stadiums. So, as mentioned earlier in the argument about how it's very expensive, you need to build a lot of infrastructure to host such a major sporting event. Because it's major and because it's international, this means that you'll have a lot of people coming in, and this means that you'll need a lot of infrastructure. And the problem that the thing that makes this problem worse is that all of these stadiums need to be located very near each other, and they need to be located in like a very geographically convenient and lucrative area, which tends to be the city area. And so you have a city which is already urbanized and already developed, and then suddenly this city needs to accommodate multiple different stadiums and an Olympic village. And so what happens is that the government is likely going to demolish communities. They're going to tear down places in order to build the stadiums, in order to host a major sporting event. And also, because the government wants the city to appear very clean and luxurious, they're likely going to push out people who are poor. They're going to push out those that are homeless in order to create this appearance for the international community that they are a very clean city, a very luxurious and a very safe city. And so this is an outcome of hosting such a major sporting event. The first thing you want to do is talk about the structural features of hosting such a major sporting event. So the structural features being that the stadiums have to be located very near each other, and the stadiums have to be all put in a very geographically convenient and profitable area, which is the city area. And therefore, given that the city is already very developed, it's likely going to always cause displacement. And this displacement will happen in a very specific way because the government wants the city to appear clean and luxurious. So they're likely going to displace those who are poor. And just an example to kind of back this argument up and to add a bit more reality to this argument. In the Rio Olympics in 2016, the government very infamously built very large, sprawling concrete walls to kind of block the visitors and tourists from seeing the favelas or the slums in Brazil. And also, there was this very infamous case of the Brazilian government displacing a community. I think the community had like around 100 or 200 families, and then after the Olympics, they only had like 20 families left. And because this community was like located in the area where they wanted to build a stadium. And so this first part mentions why displacement is going to be likely and displacement is going to be inevitable. And then the second part explains why displacement is something that is really bad. So obviously, the harm of communities being fragmented is very regrettable. You have people that are the social support networks for each other, people that grew up together, people that are friends, people that are family, being torn apart and thrown around various parts of the country just for an event that will last maybe 2 weeks, right? But the second harm is that people are going to be relocated further from where they consider home, which also means that they'll be relocated further from their jobs, which means that they'll have to now take an hour or 2 hour long commute in order to get their jobs, which often means that they lose their jobs or are forced to find different forms of employment, which puts them in a very precarious situation. So previously, perhaps they were located in a very convenient part of the city, but because now they need to make space for a stadium, they are thrown to the outskirts of the city where there are a lot less economic and employment opportunities. But the last impact here is just the loss of cultural heritage. A lot of the places where these people live are not just simple physical spaces, but are also reflections of the culture, where this is the place that they grew up. This is the place of certain cultural significance, where it holds certain memories for the community. And a lot of these physical spaces are demolished heartlessly in order to build these stadiums which have no cultural or symbolic value for any of the people. So now that we've discussed the economic harms and now that we've discussed the social cultural harms, we need to establish a counterfactual. Because if you notice, everything that I just said about the opposition case is very negative in nature, right? It's very criticism heavy. It's going to hurt the economy. It's going to hurt the people. It's going to hurt the government. But we need to give reasons as to why the comparative is better, why the country would be better off if they did not host such events, right? If you do not explain the counterfactual, the opposition case is very precarious because you run the risk of your proposition team saying that all of these harms are symmetrical, right? Like displacement will happen anyways, the economy is already really bad. Those harms might appear symmetrical unless you establish a counterfactual. So here are some ways in which you can think of the opposition counterfactual. So the first very simple counterfactual is this thing brings about more harm than benefit. Therefore, status quo is preferable. So this is a very simple counterfactual where you're simply saying that status quo might not be perfect, status quo might not be great, but it is much better than doing something that actively hurts the economy and actively hurts the people with very little benefit or with very little upside. So that's the first way in which you can kind of angle the counterfactual, which is that you make things worse, we just defend the status quo. But the second kind of way in which you can articulate the counterfactual is by saying that there are other ways to develop the economy. So this directly targets the economic benefits in which proposition says. So you could focus on things like exports, you can focus on things like agriculture, you could boost tourism through other means like focusing on your cultural heritage. All of these are ways to boost investment, boost tourism, and also just boost economic activity. Doesn't require you to take on such an exorbitant responsibility of hosting a major sporting event. And so perhaps the conclusion you want to use here is that the reason why it's a bad investment is because the amount of money that you're putting in and the amount of risk that you're taking hugely outweighs the benefits that you get, especially when the benefits are not mutually exclusive and that there are other ways for you to get the benefits. Okay, so this brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope you found this at least a bit insightful, at least a bit useful, and I hope this helps you in the future when approaching motions like this or motions that are similar to this. Thank you. Bye-bye.